Margaret Thompson stood at the edge of the hallway, her hand frozen on the doorframe, a strange unease settling in her stomach. It was the quiet that bothered her most, the stillness that had replaced the bustle of their once happy home. Her husband, Robert, had been paralyzed for years after a tragic accident, and Margaret had given up everything to care for him. Every day was the same: routine, care, sacrifice. But something felt off now. The oddities had become impossible to ignore. One night, after she had put Robert to bed, she returned to the kitchen to find an empty glass of water sitting on the counter. It wasn't hers. It wasn't Robert's either. She had filled the glass only moments earlier, and yet it was gone. She shrugged it off, but the feeling lingered. Strange things kept happening. A cold breeze in rooms with no windows, a shift in the air when no one else was around, and the whisper of movement she caught in the living room one evening. It sent chills down her spine. Margaret was no fool. Something was wrong. She couldn't keep dismissing the nagging suspicion that had gnawed at her for weeks. Something inside her told her Robert wasn't as helpless as he seemed. But how could she prove it? The next morning, she placed an order online for a small hidden camera. She didn't know what she was about to uncover, but she knew she had to find out. And once the truth was revealed, there would be no going back. The camera would arrive in 2 days. 2 days until everything changed. 2 days had passed since Margaret placed the order for the hidden camera. She had tried to focus on her daily routine, caring for Robert, preparing meals and maintaining the house, but the anticipation was nearly unbearable. Her mind kept replaying every strange moment, every whisper of doubt, and she couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. What would she find when the camera arrived? When the package finally came, Margaret wasted no time. The camera was small, discreet, and easy to hide. She set it up carefully, aiming it at the spot where she had often heard the odd noises. Robert, as usual, was lying still in his bed, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. Margaret returned to her usual duties, but her thoughts were consumed with the camera, the possible answers it might reveal. That night, after Robert had drifted off to sleep, she sat down at her laptop, her hands shaking slightly as she prepared to review the footage. Her stomach churned with a mixture of fear and curiosity. What if her suspicions were wrong? What if the truth was even worse than she feared? She clicked the play button. The footage began, showing the room in the dim light of the night. Robert was sleeping, just as Margaret had left him. The minutes ticked by, and Margaret felt a cold knot forming in her chest. There was nothing. The room was still, and Robert's slow breathing was the only sound. Her heart sank. Maybe she was just imagining things. Maybe it was all in her head. But then, just after midnight, it happened. The camera caught movement, Ada. First, it was subtle, just a faint shift of shadows, a soft creak of the floorboards. Margaret's breath hitched in her throat as she leaned in closer, her eyes glued to the screen. Robert's form seemed to twitch, and then, to her horror, she saw it. Robert moved, his arm lifted slowly, as if he was waking from a long slumber. But he hadn't been asleep. He was wide awake. Margaret's pulse raced. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Robert's hand moved again, this time with more purpose, as he reached for the blanket. It wasn't the uncoordinated, stiff movement of someone paralyzed. It was the deliberate motion of a person with full control over their body. Margaret paused the video, her breath caught in her chest. She stared at the frozen frame, her mind reeling. How could this be, she thought. She had seen him struggle with the simplest tasks, had watched him endure countless hours of physical therapy. She had cared for him, loved him, and now everything she knew was in question. Her hands shook as she played the footage again, watching as Robert's body shifted, as he pulled himself into a sitting position and quietly swung his legs off the bed. He stood up, moving slowly, but with no sign of the paralysis that had defined his life for years. He was walking. Walking. The shock hit Margaret like a punch to the gut. Her mind screamed in disbelief. She replayed the footage over and over, each time hoping that it was a trick, hoping that her eyes were deceiving her. But no matter how many times she watched it, the truth remained the same. Robert was faking it. Her heart pounded in her ears, and a cold sweat broke out across her skin. The man she had dedicated her entire life to, the man she had cared for with unwavering devotion, had been lying to her all along. For years she had believed that Robert's accident had taken away his ability to walk, his independence, his life. And yet, here he was, walking around in the middle of the night, a free man living a lie. Margaret felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The betrayal was suffocating. She had given up everything for Robert. She had sacrificed her own happiness, her own future, all for someone who didn't need her care. The weight of the realization was almost too much to bear. But as her anger began to rise, so did the need for answers. Why had Robert done this? Why had he lied to her for so long? What was his motive? She stared at the screen, her mind swirling with questions. The camera had shown her the truth, but it hadn't explained it. Margaret knew she couldn't confront Robert yet. She needed to understand more, to piece together the puzzle. She needed to know everything. She sat back in her chair, the room suddenly feeling too small, too suffocating. What was she supposed to do now? She had trusted him with everything. And now she was faced with a man who had manipulated her for years. The hours passed, and Margaret remained frozen in front of the screen, her thoughts a whirlwind of betrayal, confusion, and disbelief. It was only when the first light of dawn peeked through the curtains that she finally turned off the laptop. The footage had shattered her world, but she couldn't make any decisions in that moment. She needed time to think, to process everything she had learned. The truth was out there now, but where would it lead? The days following Margaret's discovery were a blur. She couldn't escape the image of Robert, standing, walking, moving freely when he had convinced her for years that he was paralyzed. Every room in the house seemed to hold the weight of his lies, every corner whispering the same cruel truth. It felt like a dream, one she couldn't wake up from. The truth had shattered her. But what was she supposed to do with it? Confront him? How could she? She had spent years caring for him, sacrificing everything, and now she felt like a fool. The betrayal gnawed at her, eating away at the trust she had once placed in him. But Margaret was no fool, and she wasn't going to let Robert's lies define her. She had to confront him, and she knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed someone who could help her navigate the storm she was about to unleash. She called Susan, her best friend since childhood, and explained everything. How Robert had faked his paralysis. How her entire life had been built on a lie. Susan listened in stunned silence before asking, "What do you want to do now?" Margaret's voice was steady, but there was a fire in her eyes. "I want the truth, Susan. I want him to face what he's done." Susan was there the next day, helping Margaret set the stage for the confrontation. It had to be done carefully. The truth was too explosive, too destructive to handle in the heat of the moment. They needed to catch Robert off guard, make him confess, and expose the lies he had built his entire life around. That evening, Margaret waited for Robert to return from his walk, one of his many excursions that had become part of the routine. She had already set up a second camera, this time hidden in the living room, so she could capture every moment. When Robert finally entered, she didn't wait for him to speak. "Sit down," she said, her voice cold but controlled. "We need to talk." Robert raised an eyebrow, his eyes scanning Margaret's face. He could see the tension in her expression, but he was oblivious to what was coming. He took a seat and Margaret sat across from him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Tell me the truth, Robert," she said, her voice firm but laced with pain. "All these years, you've been lying to me. You're not paralyzed, are you? For a moment, Robert looked confused, but his expression quickly shifted. Margaret saw the flicker of guilt in his eyes before he covered it up with a forced smile. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice too smooth. Of course, I'm paralyzed. What do you mean? Margaret didn't flinch. She pushed a button on her phone, and suddenly, the footage from the hidden camera played on the screen in front of them. Robert's own movements, the slow shift of his body, the careful way he stood and walked, were displayed for both of them to see. It was undeniable. Robert's face drained of colour. For the first time, Margaret saw fear in his eyes. You've been walking. All this time you've been walking, and I've been caring for you like you were an invalid. How could you do this? Margaret's voice cracked, but she regained her composure quickly. Why, Robert? Why did you lie to me? There was a long silence, and then Robert finally spoke, his voice strained. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't think it would. Margaret stood up, her fists clenched at her sides. You didn't think it would what? You didn't think I'd find out? You didn't think I'd be hurt? Robert's face twisted with regret, but there was something more. A trace of guilt, of remorse. But it wasn't enough to undo the years, of lies. I was afraid, he whispered. I was afraid of losing you. I thought if I pretended, you'd stay with me. You were the only thing that mattered, Margaret. I never wanted to hurt you. Margaret's heart was torn. The love she had for Robert had been real. But so had the betrayal. I gave you everything, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And you took it all. You used me. There was a long pause. Robert's gaze dropped to the floor, and Margaret felt the weight of her decision. She had to move on. She had to reclaim her life. I can't do this anymore, Robert, she said, her voice steady. I need to walk away. I need to find myself again. The aftermath of the confrontation left Margaret feeling like a stranger in her own home. The air between her and Robert had become suffocating, heavy, with unspoken words and regrets. She had walked away from their marriage, but she knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. She couldn't stay in the same house, couldn't continue to live in the place where her trust had been shattered. For the first time in years, Margaret felt a sense of liberation. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to be the same woman who had given up everything for a lie. She needed to rebuild herself, to reclaim the life she had lost. Margaret packed her things and moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She decorated it with a few simple touches, pictures of places she'd always wanted to visit, books she hadn't had time to read, and plants that brought a little life into the space. The apartment was quiet, peaceful, and it was the first place in a long time where she didn't feel like she was living for someone else. But the adjustment was harder than she had expected. She spent her days cleaning, organizing, and trying to find some semblance of routine. There were moments when she thought about Robert, about the years they had spent together, about the life they had built. But she pushed those thoughts away. She couldn't afford to look back. She needed to move forward. It was during one of these quiet moments that Margaret made a decision. She had always wanted to paint, had always been drawn to art, but had never allowed herself the time to pursue it. Now, in this new chapter of her life, she could. She signed up for an art class at the local community centre. It was a small step, but it felt like a giant leap for Margaret, a way to reclaim a piece of herself that had been buried for too long. The first class was intimidating. There were people there who had been painting for years, their canvases filled with beautiful, intricate designs. Margaret felt like a beginner, unsure of her abilities, but she was determined to push through the discomfort, determined to find her voice again. As the weeks went by, Margaret's artwork began to evolve. She poured her emotions, her pain, her anger, her hopes into each brushstroke. Her art became a reflection of her journey, a way to process the chaos inside her. And as she painted, she felt herself changing. The woman who had been consumed by Robert's lies was slowly being replaced by someone stronger, someone who had reclaimed her independence. One evening, after class, her instructor pulled her aside. "Margaret, your work is incredible. You have a real talent. I think you should consider submitting some of your pieces for the upcoming exhibition. People would want to see your work." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. An exhibition? She hadn't even considered it. But the thought of sharing her art with the world felt like a new beginning. She smiled, for the first time in a long while, at the possibility of a future that was entirely her own. It wasn't just about painting. It was about rediscovering herself, about finding strength in the midst of heartbreak. Margaret was no longer defined by Robert's lies. She was defined by her own resilience, by her determination to move forward. And as she stood in front of her canvas, Margaret realized that the woman she was becoming was far more powerful than the one she had left behind. The days turned into weeks, and Margaret's life in the apartment began to settle into a new rhythm. Her art, once a way to escape the pain, had become her purpose. She poured everything into it, each brushstroke an attempt to reclaim what had been stolen from her. She hadn't expected the transformation to feel so profound, so freeing, yet here she was, surrounded by her own work, standing stronger than she ever thought possible. But even in the sanctuary she had created for herself, there were moments when the past crept in. It was late one evening when the doorbell rang. Margaret froze. She hadn't been expecting anyone, especially not Robert, but as she opened the door, there he was. "Margaret," Robert's voice cracked. His face was drawn, pale, his usually confident demeanor replaced by uncertainty. "I've been trying to reach you." Margaret stepped back, her hand gripping the doorframe as she looked at him, at the man who had broken her, the man who had lied, the man who had once been her whole world. "What do you want, Robert?" she asked, her voice steady but cold. I don't know where to begin," he stammered. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need to apologize. I've been living in a lie. I've been living in guilt, and it's eating me alive." Margaret's heart raced, but she didn't let her emotions show. She had fought too hard to find herself, too hard to regain control of her life, to let Robert back in so easily. "I'm not here to make excuses," Robert continued, "but I need you to know that I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to deceive you." Margaret took a deep breath, trying to hold back the anger that was bubbling inside her. "You did hurt me, Robert. You took everything from me, and you didn't even care." Robert lowered his head, unable to look her in the eye. "I was selfish. I was scared. I thought if I could keep you in my life, even in that way, I wouldn't lose you." Margaret's voice was quiet but firm. "I have to go on without you. Robert, I can't keep living in your shadow. I've already lost too much time." For a moment Robert didn't speak, but his eyes were filled with regret. Margaret had been his everything, and he realized too late that his fear had caused irreversible damage. "I understand," he whispered, taking a step back. "I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I wish I had been better." Margaret nodded, closing the door softly behind her. She didn't need closure from him. What she needed was to continue building her life, one free from the lies he had woven into her world. The exhibition was just around the corner, and Margaret had poured herself into preparing for it. The small community art show was a big step, but it wasn't just about showcasing her work. It was about declaring to the world that she was more than her past. She was more than the woman who had been deceived, more than the woman who had sacrificed everything for someone else. This was her time. The night of the exhibition arrived, and Margaret stood in front of her paintings, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and anxiety. She hadn't expected this, to stand in front of a crowd and feel proud of what she had created. But as people wandered through the gallery, stopping to admire her pieces, she realized something. She wasn't just an artist, she was a survivor. As she walked through the room, she caught the eye of one of the curators. He smiled warmly, approaching her with a look of genuine interest. "These are extraordinary," he said. "Your work is raw, honest. There's so much emotion in it. I'd love to talk to you more about displaying some of these pieces in a larger venue." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. A larger venue. The idea seemed almost surreal, but this was exactly what she had been working toward. The recognition, the acknowledgement, the validation of her own strength. She had poured herself into her art, and now it was paying off. As the evening went on, Margaret felt a quiet sense of pride swell inside her. She wasn't defined by the past, by the lies, or by Robert's betrayal. She was her own person, an artist, a woman with a future. As the night came to a close, Margaret stepped outside into the cool air. She had done it. She had taken the first step towards something bigger, something that was all her own.